My name's Louise Apprentice. I'm 32, and I want to start with the phone call that came in at 10:40 on a Wednesday night, because that call is the reason I actually know the truth about what happened to my grandfather in his final weeks. Ms. Prentice, I'm sorry to call so late. This is Yolanda, one of the hospice nurses who's been caring for your grandfather. I probably shouldn't be calling you like this, but I've been sitting with something for a few days now, and I don't think I can keep sitting with it quietly anymore. I remember gripping my phone a little tighter, sitting up straighter on my couch. What's going on, Yolanda? Is he okay? He's stable, physically, she said. This isn't about his health directly. It's about something I witnessed a few times now, involving your brother, and I think you deserve to know about it, even though I probably shouldn't be the one telling you. That call ended up unraveling something that had been happening quietly, deliberately, over the final 6 weeks of my grandfather's life. And by the time the full picture came together, I understood that my brother hadn't just been visiting our dying grandfather more often than the rest of us. He'd been doing something far more calculated than that. Let me back up, though, because you need the whole family picture first, or none of what happened is going to make sense. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, the younger of 2 grandchildren raised close to our grandfather, Harlan Prentice, after both our parents died in a car accident when I was 9, and my brother, Desmond, was 12. Harlan and our grandmother, Vivian, took us in without hesitation, raised us the rest of the way through childhood in the same house Harlan had lived in for almost 50 years. Vivian passed away herself about 8 years ago, leaving Harlan alone in that house, though still sharp, still independent well into his 80s, the kind of man who mowed his own lawn until his knees finally gave out on him a couple years back. Desmond and I had a reasonably close relationship growing up, typical sibling dynamics, closer during some periods than others. But something had shifted between us over the past several years, a distance that had crept in gradually, mostly, I think, because Desmond had struggled financially in ways that created an underlying tension whenever money came up, which it seemed to more and more as we both got older. Desmond worked in commercial real estate, a career that had looked promising initially, but had taken some serious hits during a couple of market downturns, leaving him in a precarious financial position for years at a time, something he was never fully transparent about with the rest of the family, though it was pretty obvious from certain patterns, like sudden requests for loans from Harlan that never quite got explained in detail. I worked as a veterinary technician, stable but modest income, never anything flashy, though I'd built a comfortable, reasonably secure life for myself over the years, mostly through careful budgeting rather than any particular financial windfall. Harlan's estate wasn't enormous, but it was substantial enough to matter, the house itself worth a fair amount given how much the Asheville real estate market had appreciated over the decades he'd owned it, plus modest savings and some investments he'd built up carefully over a long working life as an engineer. Harlan's original will, drafted probably 15 years earlier, split everything evenly between Desmond and me. Straightforward, uncomplicated, the kind of arrangement that made sense given how equally he'd always treated us growing up, despite whatever differences existed between our adult lives. About 7 months before that phone call from Yolanda, Harlan was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer, the kind of diagnosis that comes with a devastating, short timeline attached to it. He decided, after some initial treatment options were discussed, and ultimately declined given his age and the aggressive nature of the cancer, to move into home hospice care rather than pursue aggressive treatment that likely wouldn't have extended his life meaningfully anyway. Desmond, notably, started visiting far more frequently once the diagnosis came through, something that, at the time, I genuinely read as a positive sign, a brother finally stepping up to spend meaningful time with our dying grandfather, the kind of response you'd hope to see rather than something to be suspicious of. I visited regularly too, though my schedule as a vet tech made it harder to be there as consistently as Desmond, who'd recently left his real estate job, ostensibly to focus on caring for Harlan during his final months, something the whole family, myself included initially, viewed as a genuinely admirable sacrifice. Looking back now, I understand that Desmond's sudden availability wasn't purely coincidental to his job situation, and it definitely wasn't purely about caring for Harlan out of love alone. Here's what Yolanda actually told me, piece by piece, over that first phone call and a couple of follow-up conversations over the following days. She'd been working as one of Harlan's rotating hospice nurses for about 5 weeks by the time she called me, present for several shifts each week, close enough to the daily rhythm of Harlan's care to notice patterns that a less consistent visitor might have missed entirely. "Your brother's been having very specific conversations with your grandfather," she told me, "usually when he thought no one else was really paying attention. Or maybe he just didn't think of hospice staff as people who'd actually notice or remember details. But we do notice things, Ms. Prentice. It's part of the job, honestly, keeping an eye on a patient's overall well-being, which sometimes includes noticing when family dynamics seem, I don't know, off in some way." She described several specific instances, over multiple weeks, where she'd overheard Desmond talking to Harlan about me, always framed in a particular, consistent narrative. According to what Desmond apparently told our grandfather repeatedly, I'd become distant, uninterested, too busy with my own life to properly show up for Harlan during his final months, while Desmond, by contrast, had sacrificed his entire career to be there constantly, the one truly devoted grandchild in Harlan's final chapter. "That's not true," I said, my voice catching slightly, sitting there on my couch feeling something cold settle into my stomach. "I've been visiting as much as my work schedule allows. I call him almost every day when I can't be there in person." "I believe you," Yolanda said. "That's actually part of why I'm calling. Because from what I've observed, your grandfather seemed genuinely confused at times about how often you'd actually been visiting, almost like he'd lost track of reality slightly regarding your actual level of involvement, compared to what your brother kept telling him." She went on to describe something even more concerning. About 3 weeks before that call, an estate attorney had come to the house, at Desmond's specific arrangement, to discuss updating Harlan's will. Yolanda hadn't been present for the actual legal conversation, obviously, since that wasn't part of her medical role, but she'd been in the house during the visit, and had overheard enough, in passing, to understand that something significant was being discussed regarding how the estate would ultimately be divided. "I don't know the specific details of what changed," she told me, "but I do know your grandfather seemed different after that visit. More confused some days, especially in the evenings, which honestly isn't unusual given his medication and the progression of his illness. But I also noticed your brother seemed different too, afterward. More relaxed, somehow. Like something he'd been working toward for a while had finally gotten resolved." I sat with all of this for a long moment after that first call ended, trying to process what I was actually hearing, what it actually implied about what might have happened to Harlan's original, straightforward, even split between Desmond and me. I want to be honest that my first instinct wasn't immediate suspicion of some grand scheme. I genuinely wondered, initially, whether Harlan, faced with his own mortality, had simply decided on his own that Desmond's sacrifice of his career to provide daily care deserved additional recognition in the will, something that might have felt reasonable to him even without any manipulation involved. But the more I thought about the specific pattern Yolanda described, the narrative Desmond had apparently been feeding Harlan repeatedly over multiple weeks about my supposed distance and disinterest, the more it started feeling less like an organic decision Harlan had reached on his own, and more like something carefully, deliberately cultivated. I decided I needed to actually see Harlan myself, directly, to understand what was really happening, rather than just processing everything secondhand through Yolanda's observations, however genuinely concerned and well-intentioned they clearly were. I drove out to Harlan's house the following day, a visit I'd normally have scheduled around my work shift anyway, but this time with a very specific purpose in mind, beyond just spending time with him. Harlan seemed tired when I arrived, the cancer having progressed enough by that point that his good hours had become increasingly limited, mostly clustered in the earlier part of each day, before medication and fatigue took over more fully. But he was lucid, genuinely present, when I sat down beside his bed. "Grandpa," I said carefully, "I wanted to ask you something. Desmond mentioned you'd updated your will recently. Can you tell me a little about that?" He was quiet for a moment, something flickering across his face that I couldn't quite read at first. "Desmond said that would probably come up eventually," he said finally. "He said you might not understand, given how things have been between the two of you." "How things have been between us," I repeated slowly. "Grandpa, what has Desmond been telling you about me?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I could see, clearly, that whatever narrative had been built over the past several weeks had genuinely taken root, at least partially, in how Harlan currently understood our relative involvement in his final months. "He said you'd been busy," Harlan said. "Focused on your own life." He said he understood, that everyone processes things differently, but that it made sense, given everything, that his contribution should probably be recognized a bit more significantly, since he's the one who's actually been here every day. I felt something break slightly in my chest, hearing that, understanding now, directly from Harlan himself, exactly how thoroughly Desmond's narrative had shaped our grandfather's understanding of a situation that simply wasn't true. "Grandpa," I said, keeping my voice as steady and gentle as I could manage, "I need you to know something. I've been calling you almost every single day. I've been here every week that my work schedule allows, sometimes twice a week when I can manage it. I haven't been distant. I haven't been uninterested. I love you, and I've been trying to show up for you exactly the way I always have." He looked at me for a long moment, something shifting slowly across his face, a kind of dawning confusion mixed with something that looked almost like realization slowly settling in. "He told me you'd said you were too overwhelmed to visit as much," Harlan said quietly, "that you needed space, that this whole situation was hard for you emotionally, and that you'd asked him to just handle most of the day-to-day so you could process things on your own terms." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the full scope of the manipulation finally coming into focus. Desmond hadn't just been quietly, subtly positioning himself as the more devoted grandchild through his own increased presence. He'd actively fabricated specific statements, attributed directly to me, explaining away my genuine, consistent involvement as some kind of emotional avoidance, feeding Harlan a false narrative carefully enough, consistently enough, that our dying grandfather had genuinely come to believe I'd asked to be less involved, rather than understanding the reality that I'd simply been balancing a demanding work schedule with as much visiting as I could realistically manage. I called an elder law attorney the following week, a careful, thorough woman named Priscilla Nwachukwu, who specialized specifically in cases involving undue influence and testamentary capacity, referred to me by a friend who dealt with something somewhat similar in her own family years earlier. I explained the entire situation to Priscilla, everything Yolanda had told me, everything Harlan himself had confirmed directly about the narrative Desmond had apparently constructed over multiple weeks. "This is a classic pattern for undue influence claims," Priscilla told me. "Isolating the testator, in this case somewhat gradually through fabricated narratives about your involvement, combined with the timing of arranging an estate attorney visit during a period of declining health and increased medication, all of this could constitute grounds to challenge whatever changes were made to the will, assuming your grandfather's testamentary capacity was genuinely compromised during that specific process." She explained that we'd need documentation, ideally including Yolanda's first-hand observations as a medical professional present during much of this time frame, along with any records regarding Harlan's medication schedule and cognitive state around the specific date the will was reportedly updated. I called Yolanda again, carefully, explaining the situation and asking whether she'd be willing to provide a formal statement regarding what she'd observed, understanding fully that this was asking her to potentially involve herself in something well beyond her normal professional role. "I've actually been thinking about this a lot since I first called you," she told me. "I think I have an obligation here, honestly, beyond just my specific medical duties. What I witnessed felt like something that genuinely compromised your grandfather's ability to make a clear, informed decision about something this significant. I'm willing to provide a statement." Priscilla and I decided, given everything, on a specific approach rather than immediately pursuing a full legal challenge that would take months and potentially cause significant additional stress to Harlan during whatever time he had left. We requested a private meeting with Harlan, along with his original estate attorney, someone who'd drafted his previous will 15 years earlier and had a long-standing, trusted relationship with him, separate from the newer attorney Desmond had specifically arranged for the recent update. I want to be honest that this wasn't purely about protecting my own inheritance, though I won't pretend that consideration was entirely absent either. What actually mattered most to me, sitting with everything Priscilla explained about undue influence and compromised decision-making, was making sure that whatever final decisions Harlan made about his own estate genuinely reflected his own actual wishes, rather than a narrative deliberately constructed to manipulate those wishes during one of the most vulnerable periods of his entire life. The meeting happened about 10 days later, Harlan having a relatively good, clear-headed day that week, something his hospice team helped coordinate carefully to ensure we were working within a window when his cognitive clarity was as strong as it was likely to get, given his declining condition. His original attorney, a longtime family friend named Gerald Whitfield, walked Harlan back through the will as it had originally stood, and then, gently, carefully, through what had changed in the more recent update Desmond had arranged. The changes, it turned out, were significant. The recent update had shifted the split from an even division between Desmond and me to a 70-30 split favoring Desmond, along with language specifically framing this change as reflecting Desmond's primary caregiving role during Harlan's final illness. Language that, when Gerald read it aloud carefully, Harlan visibly reacted to with what looked like genuine surprise. "I don't remember agreeing to that specific number," Harlan said slowly, something clouded and uncertain in his voice as he tried to reconstruct the actual conversation from weeks earlier. "I remember talking about Desmond doing more, about wanting to acknowledge that somehow. But 70-30, that specific split, I don't actually remember agreeing to that number directly." Gerald walked him through it carefully, patiently, without pushing in either direction, simply laying out the actual language of both versions side by side so Harlan could genuinely, clearly evaluate what he actually wanted. Now, with full information, and without the specific narrative Desmond had constructed still actively shaping his understanding of the situation. I told Harlan, directly, in that meeting, everything about my actual involvement over the previous months. The calls, the visits, the specific things I genuinely said, versus what Desmond had apparently attributed to me. I brought printouts of my phone records showing the actual frequency of my calls, something Priscilla had suggested preparing in advance, understanding that concrete documentation would matter more, in this specific context, than simply my word against Desmond's account of what I'd supposedly said. Harlan sat with all of this for a long moment, clearly processing, clearly working through some difficult recalibration of his understanding of the past several months. "I think," he said finally, slowly, "I need to think about this more carefully, without anyone else's version of things influencing me right now. Gerald, can you help me actually think through what I want, based on what's real, not based on what I've been told secondhand?" Over the following week, working carefully with Gerald, rather than the attorney Desmond had originally arranged, Harlan ultimately decided to restore the original even split between Desmond and me. Though he did add a smaller, specific bequest to Desmond acknowledging the time he'd spent physically present during those final months. A modest, reasonable acknowledgement that felt genuinely fair, rather than the significantly skewed arrangement that had resulted from weeks of carefully constructed narrative manipulation. I confronted Desmond directly once this had all been resolved, a conversation that happened in Harlan's own living room, with Harlan present, since I felt strongly that this needed to happen with our grandfather actually witnessing the full truth, rather than continuing to exist in whatever separate, managed reality Desmond had been constructing around him. "You told Grandpa I said things I never said," I told Desmond, keeping my voice steady despite how much anger I was genuinely feeling in that moment. "You used his declining health, his medication, his isolation during his final months, to manipulate him into believing a false story about my involvement, specifically to benefit yourself financially." Desmond didn't deny it outright, which honestly surprised me a little, though he tried, initially, to reframe it as something less calculated than what it actually was. "I was here every day," he said. "You weren't. I don't think it's unreasonable that Grandpa wanted to acknowledge that." "I was here as much as my job allowed," I said, "and even if you genuinely believed your presence deserved additional recognition, that doesn't give you the right to fabricate specific statements and attribute them directly to me, manipulating a dying man's understanding of reality to secure a financial outcome you wanted." Harlan, sitting there listening to this exchange, finally spoke up himself, his voice frail but clear. "Desmond, I need you to understand something," he said. "I love you. I'm grateful for the time you spent here. But what you did, telling me things about your sister that weren't true, that's not something I can just move past easily. That's not the kind of thing family does to each other, especially not during something like this. Desmond didn't have a good response to that. I watched something crumble slightly in his expression, some combination of shame and, I think, genuine surprise at hearing Harlan articulate the situation so plainly and directly. I want to walk you through what happened in the remaining weeks of Harlan's life, because I think that matters as much as the confrontation itself, maybe more. Harlan passed away about 5 weeks after that conversation, peacefully, at home, with both Desmond and me present, along with Yolanda, who'd become, by that point, someone far more significant to our family than just a rotating hospice nurse doing her job. The relationship between Desmond and me during those final 5 weeks was strained, understandably, though we both made an effort, for Harlan's sake, to maintain some baseline civility rather than letting the conflict dominate whatever time he had left. I think, looking back, that effort mattered to Harlan, genuinely, watching us find a way to coexist in that space, despite everything that had happened. After Harlan's death, the will proceeded exactly as he'd redecided it in that final, clear-headed meeting with Gerald, the even split restored, with the smaller specific bequest to Desmond acknowledging his caregiving time still intact, a version of the arrangement that felt, ultimately, fair and genuinely reflective of what Harlan actually wanted once the manipulation had been identified and addressed. Desmond and I haven't fully repaired our relationship since all of this happened. It's been about 7 months now, and we're civil, we communicate when necessary, particularly regarding the ongoing logistics of settling Harlan's estate. But the trust that existed between us before this, whatever remained of typical sibling closeness, despite our other differences over the years, hasn't really come back, and honestly, I'm not sure it fully will. I think about that phone call from Yolanda often, how close this entire situation came to resolving exactly the way Desmond intended, if she hadn't decided, against her better judgment about staying strictly within her professional boundaries, that what she'd witnessed mattered enough to actually speak up about it. I don't know what would have happened if she'd stayed quiet, if I'd simply found out about the changed will after Harlan's death, with no context, no understanding of the manipulation that had actually shaped that decision, likely just assuming, painfully, that Harlan had simply decided, on his own, that I deserved less than Desmond in his final assessment of our respective devotion to him. But she didn't stay quiet. And because of that, Harlan got the chance to actually understand what had really been happening around him during some of the most vulnerable weeks of his life, and to make a final decision about his own estate that genuinely reflected his real understanding of both his grandchildren, rather than a carefully managed version of reality constructed specifically to benefit one of us at the other's expense. That's really the whole story when I sit back and think about it honestly. Not some big, dramatic courtroom battle, no screaming confrontation caught on camera. Just a nurse who decided a private conversation mattered more than staying strictly within her professional boundaries. A grandfather who deserved the chance to see clearly before making his final decisions. And a sister who almost lost far more than money because someone she trusted decided manipulation was an acceptable price for getting what he wanted.